Thank you, Inger, and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure for me, of course, every year to be here, but then seeing that the crowd of friends and partners, people who's interested in what we're doing, is growing every year. Of course, the purpose of the whole conference is for us to speak to the broader Norwegian stakeholder environment and explain what we're doing. Not Erik Solheim's story that private sector is important, because I think that part of the debate is over. We need to explain to you how we fit into that picture. Earlier years we have explained sort of why we do energy, why banks are important, why PE funds should be part of our mandate, and why we do agri-investment in Africa in particular. What we're trying to do today is sort of to pull the message together and then see the full picture, which is really that in a sense, everything of what we do is to support the growth of SMEs in a larger scale. And I'll try to explain to you how that comes together, and my colleague after the break will come back. But before doing so, let's take one step back and then start a different place. I think Kristin mentioned in her intervention 19 million young people enter the workforce in sub-Saharan Africa this year. Of these 19 million, 42% have a tertiary education. Actually, this year 3 million are enrolled in universities in sub-Saharan Africa. Though there are reasons for concern, the quality is often not up to standard. In terms of the share of the population, it's still far lower than in Asia, but also lower than in Latin America. So we need to do more. And there's a bit of a mismatch. There are too many social sciences, too few engineers, technicians, and accountants, those people working on the ground. So there are definitely issues that we need to be concerned with. And if you can trust the numbers, in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, young people with education is more likely to be unemployed than uneducated, which is really upside down compared particularly to this part of the world. Leave that for now, but keep this as a backdrop for what I'm about to explain to you. The storyline is really why SMEs are important, in particular for Africa, but of course it goes across the board. That's Beck's story, and I'll also come back to that. But Africa illustrates why it's so particularly important here. I'll try to explain very briefly why it's difficult to grow them and where we fits in, and then at the end of the presentation, explain to you more in detail what we have been doing over the last 12 months in Norfund. Most of you are probably aware of the fact that the population in sub-Saharan Africa will grow from 1 to 2 billion between now and 2050. Not everybody understands how different that is from the rest of the world. I mean, this is India and China. Sub-Saharan Africa will pass in size India and China. China is in fact starting to decline. Not even that, inside Africa, if you compare US and Nigeria, Nigeria is likely to pass US in terms of population in the mid-2030s. The demographics here is really fundamentally important going forward, and Africa is so different. Convert this into the labor force. Well, this is the net growth in the labor force by region and some of the important countries. And you see, this is really where Africa stands out. 830 million new people entering the labor force between now and 2050. India being the only other region of any size in terms of growth. China is starting to decline like Europe. One more on demographics. As you can see, this is Uganda and it's Norway. And it sort of basically shows the age profile of the two sexes. And also at the former conferences, I've always tried sort of for pedagogical reason to have one illustration of how different Norway is compared to poor countries in the world, but also most of the rest of the world. This time, the story is another one. It's about how different Africa is. Because this was Norway in 1905. Even in 1905, at the past of the last century, the growth of population was slower than in Africa today. This is Norway today. But this is also how most of the world look like. So this is really where Africa stands out as different from China and from of course, in particular, the developed world. Repeating some of the numbers that has been mentioned before, 80% of the population in the informal sector, only over the next 15 years, 370 million young people will enter the labor force in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the broader developing world, 9 out of 10 jobs are in private sector. It's repeated before, but it's profoundly important. And then sort of getting closer to the SME story, 80% of SMEs in the developing world, or 80% of the population is working in SMEs. So, I mean, SMEs are extremely important. A little bit about poverty, and starting with sub-Saharan Africa again. It's definitely improving. The number of absolutely poor people is declining. It's important to remember that this is on top of the high population growth. So if you had Chinese population growth, it would definitely come down much more steeply. This is a China story, so that's what we would like to see more of, actually. The UN General Assembly will next month decide on the longer-term sustainability goals. One of them, of course, being doing away with absolute poverty. In that, going forward, that more and more is going to be an issue of how successful Africa is in developing Africa, and we carefully helping to do so. Basically, what is needed to meet the target by 2030 is to take economic growth in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to the Chinese level. This is what would happen if we had, from now on until 2030, had the same growth level in sub-Saharan Africa that we've seen in China over the last 2 decades. So it's much about economic growth. I'll come back to that. Another way of sort of explaining you sort of the scale of the transformation that needs to take place to be successful in poverty alleviation. Today, 60% of the workforce in Africa works in agriculture, very poor, low productivity. I mean, the only way forward is that most of these people move to the cities or into other kind of employment. So if we're optimistic, we could hope to take that figure down from 60 to 20 years from now. That will sort of free 40% of the workforce that need employment in other places. And this is largely the explanation why the urbanization rate in Africa is bigger and higher at the present than anywhere else in the world. These people will move to the cities. It's been said before, 80% work in informal sector. If to take to create this broader middle class and do away with poverty, what we could hope for was that the informal sector was reduced from 80 to 20. What does that entail? Well, that's basically only about SMEs. That's basically taking SMEs in informal sector to the formal sector, starting to pay taxes, but also then acquire rights for pension or whatever follows a more formalized economy. And then sort of repeat the population thing from 1 to 2 billion. Unless we're able to grow SMEs on a large scale in the countryside and in the cities over the next few decades, in particular in Africa, due to the population growth, but also for the need to take people out of agriculture to other sources of income and formalize the economy. This is, it's very much about the SMEs, and that's why it's so important. But Beck also reminded us, I mean, SMEs is not about Africa. SMEs is about this country. We have a big discussion. Are we innovative enough? Do we have not have enough startups? All the big organizations and all countries in the world, including Singapore, have a policy to how to promote innovation and SMEs. And the reason being, SMEs, they are the big employment machine. They are the only way that you can convert the informal to the formal sector. And that's the way, as James also explained, building SMEs is a way to build local ownership, to build the local, to build the big middle class that we need in a more developed world. So this is why it's important. And this is basically, again, Erik Solheim's story. In the long term, it's only one recipe: high economic growth, hopefully one which is labor-intensive, creating job, the middle class, and by doing so, taking down poverty. There are no other long-term way out of poverty. So why is it important? Well, five elements. As also Erik Solheim said, it's very much about political stability, and even better, politicians that are also providing an enabling environment, foreseeable. And then it's about access to finance, it's about transport, and it's about reliable electricity. And if you ask companies across the developing and developed world, this is a short story. And particularly in Africa, nothing is more important for electricity than electricity, reliable electricity, not a solar panel in a remote village, a reliable electricity system, because that's how a modern economy works. And it's about finance, and it's about transport. So the optimistic story is that we're able to sort it out. You see political stability and providing an enabling environment. So, and then what I call the infrastructure enablers, access to finance, reliable electricity and transport. If that starts to move, then it works. This basically explains the Norfund strategy. Why finance and why electricity is so high on our agenda, and how that fits with the SME story. After the break, we will hear more about what we do in terms of financial institutions and banks, and also you'll hear more about some of our investees, and the same with SME funds. We've been struggling to get this message across why equity PE funds are important. Well, I mean, I think after the presentation today, it'll be easier to understand. Clean energy, we've been doing before. Then let me speak very briefly to what Norfund has been doing over the last 12 months, since the last summer conference in August last year. Last year, we invested a record level, 3.65 billion NOK. Much about an energy investment, but also across the board. Basically, the pipeline, as we call it, the number of potential good investments with deep development impact, providing energy and other sort of infrastructure support for SMEs. The projects are there. This year we are likely to be close to 2 billion. That's partly or largely actually because of Equity Bank, which is a big chunk of the financial institution investment this year. This is a spaghetti sort of showing all the 22 investments we did over the last 12 months. I will not go into, of course, all of it, but I'll speak very shortly to three to illustrate it. And starting with James Monge, we're so proud to be a part of Equity Bank. I'm sorry, I'm outdated already in terms of number of customers. Equity Bank has been managed to grow by, if I understand correctly, close to 500,000 customers a year. We need institutions like that able to scale what they're doing, and over time taking down the cost in the system. I mean, we're simply proud to be part of it. It's and we look forward to a long-term relationship. And I will not add to that now. We could. You've heard the story that James told us before. The other big investment that we did last year was Globelec, an energy company that we bought together with CDC, our English counterpart. It's all about Africa. And in the present portfolio, natural gas-fired power, solar and wind, and a bit of heavy fuel oil. Going forward, to us, it's much about gas-fired power. You need that to provide reliable electricity on each coast. And with CDC, the message to the new management in Globelec is, we'll support you for the next 10 years. You go out there and build 5,000 megawatts. Back to Norway and back to some of the issues that Erik Solheim brought up. How do we find a way to open up these markets for the big financial institution and investor in our part of the world? We're very proud that we've had this co-investment cooperation with KLP since 2003. Earlier this year, it was scaled up from 700 million to 1.7 billion. Because KLP wanted to stop doing coal, so they basically de-invested in the coal sector, took back 500 million, asked us to go and invest it in developing countries. So we were proud of that and illustrate exactly what Erik Solheim said. Different issue, but again, very much according to what Erik said. We had this meeting on the future of development finance in July. The General Assembly will decide on the development goals in September in New York, and the world will gather in Paris to discuss climate in November, December. There's one common denominator. So basically what you see is a massive policy shift from public sector aid, public sector to public sector, grant-based aid, to a different way of catalyzing private sector investments. Completely consistent with Erik Solheim's message. And then how do we do it? Well, 16th of July, the DFID, the UK the Department for Development, announced that they would inject 735 million pound new capital, fresh capital, in CDC, the Norfund parallel in the UK. Basically because as an instrument, it's difficult to find better and more potent way of doing this private-public partnership. And putting public money in good use. But I'm happy to say that if you look at Norway, this is really one of the areas where Norway have taken a lead. Government after government, a parliament after parliament, a budget after budget have for the last 17 years have injected more capital in Norfund because they would like to see the fund grow. And this year, 1.5 billion, over the last 10 years, 8.6 billion. And there are no indication in the parliament that this is the end to it. Some of you probably read that in Finland, they reduced the aid budget dramatically. There was only one item of the budget that increased, capital allocation to FinFund. So I think you see the same across the board. FMO in the Netherlands is getting more to the center stage. The development finance institutions, as we are, is getting so much more important because we resonate so much with the overall policy priorities, and we are a perfect instrument to put good public money in good use in private sector. So we more and more speak to the fact that we are part of this EDFI family. There are 15 of the same DFIs in Europe. At the end of last year, they had a portfolio of 33 billion euro invested. They invested 6.2 billion last year. We are all, we're for good reason, asked to explain. So what's the developmental effect of what we're doing? And to me, this is basically the story. There was a study by the Overseas Development Institute in London published 2-3 years back, basically showing that if you increase DFI investments in LDC by 10%, GDP will grow by 1.3% in these countries. It actually works. It works in macro. We'll go back, we'll update these studies, we'll do more of that, but basically explain it. It is about economic growth. It is about finding a way to combine public and private money. 2 slides list. We're in the midst of a big strategy review of what we're doing. One of the things we've been doing is to sort of go fairly deeply into our portfolio. We did an analysis of all the exits that Norfund have done since we started in 97. 56 direct investment, 200 exits in funds, 2.9 billion NOK altogether. On average, a holding period of 6 years and 5% IRR. To me, fairly decent story to tell. If you look at employment, well, these companies, they grow after when we own them, but they keep growing afterwards. So we went back and looked at all the exits that we've exited over this period of time to see where are they now. Last slide, which is basically the most, to me, convincing and sort of we have to stop this debate about private sector, as I actually said. But we also have to stop questioning if profitability makes sense. In a portfolio, of all of these 250 companies, distinguishing between those who didn't very much succeed, was loss-making, moderate profitability and high profitability, well, the one who hire more people are the most profitable for obvious reasons. But we need to tell the story because some people in the Norwegian stakeholder environment sort of question us, maybe you earn too much money, maybe you should be concerned. It is about profitable businesses. That's the James Munger story about growing his bank. He couldn't attract new capital to grow the bank unless it was so profitable. And that's the story in our portfolio. So that's my story. Thank you.